There's so much more that goes into that final look of a quilt, and what comes into play when we're talking about being accurate in piecing than just your seam allowance. It's not just about your seam allowance. There's all these other things. And I've broken it down. We've done part 1 through 4 in the past few weeks. And so now it's my last segment. Those last little bits to pin or not to pin, when, how, all those things. So let's check out my piecing accuracy, part 5. In this part 5 of our piecing accuracy and final part, I want to talk about specific techniques and detail work. For example, matching up seams, points, and other things like that. I featured in our pressing segment how I like to press seams to one side so that when I need to fit them together, they are pressed opposite and the seams will nest. What that means is as I put things together, they will go to opposite sides so I can feel those seams nesting together, and then I can make sure to pin those intersections when I'm sewing the unit together so that everything will match up nicely. Now that brings me to this part about pinning. So I am personally don't pin a whole lot, but when it comes to accuracy and precision, I like to pin the parts that matter. These are my favorite pins for piecing. These are the Magic Flat Hat pins. The things you want in a good pin for piecing is a really sharp pin and still substantial enough. It needs to be thin, but substantial enough so it's not going to bend on you, but really nice and sharp so you can easily go through the fabrics. And I love those. I love the flathead. It is, you can iron over these because they are heat resistant, and they're easy to grab with my fingers. So it's not just a ball, so it's really nice to grab. These are my favorites. So what you want to do when you're pinning, and this is something I've seen in classes, is when you're going to pin the seam that people pin like this. So if you were to pin this way, and then you're going to sew here, that's not really going to secure the parts together that need to match. The fabrics can still slide apart even though the pin is over here. You always want to pin across the direction that you're sewing. So if you're sewing across this intersection here, you want to make sure to pin it this way to really keep it in place. Yes, you do need to remove the pin before you stitch over it, but this is important to pin it this way because now these fabrics are not going to move as you go across that intersection this way. So that is number 1. Now, what if we're piecing something where we need to match a point to a point, not just intersecting seams? So for example, if we're doing flying geese, what if we wanted to really make sure to match these points? And here is my technique doing that. When you are if you can't, sometimes we can nest the intersections and really make the points come together and just look and see if they are matching and pin it that way. Sometimes I want to get a little more specific. So what I do, I take a pin and I will push the pin right through the intersection where that point of this flying geese is. So I'm going to just stick it straight through, just straight through. So it's really sticking right through there, right at the point, and I can adjust if I didn't hit it. So right at the point that I want to match up. So it's coming through right here. And then I'm going to poke the pin also through the other piece where I want those points to match up. So now the pin is just holding these, just poking right through the points that want to match up. So this is really spinning on top of this. So you want to keep the pin straight through and make sure you are nesting those intersections. Sometimes it's not nesting. Sometimes they have seams that are right on top of each other. But you want to keep this pin straight. Then I take 2 more pins and I will pin on each side keeping that pin straight. And not until I have secured each side, I can remove that straight pin through. The reason why I don't just take this pin and flip it is that when you flip it, you actually slide that piece a little bit. So now it is secure. As you sew over it, you can really watch where you want that seam to land so that you don't lose your points. And so this is my techniques. I prefer the 2 pins versus a fork pin because I can have better control on each side where that pin goes in. So that's what I like to use when I need to pin 2 points together like that. The next technique I wanted to talk to you about is whenever you have a bias edge. So for example, here is my Ava pattern, and you start off with making blocks, and then you actually diagonally cut those blocks apart and end up with 2 units like this. So this is obviously cut on the bias. In the pattern, you then go ahead and add a strip that is cut into a parallelogram between those pieces. But this strip is cut on the straighter grain. So it's cut as straighter grain strips and then into the parallelograms. So we know this is the straighter grain here on this side. This is the bias edge because it was cut on the diagonal. So when we are sewing these on, a very good rule of thumb is our rule that we call bob. And that is we want to have bias on the bottom. You want to have the straighter grain, the more stable piece of fabric on the top when you feed this through your sewing machine. And that's really going to stabilize the underside, the bias edge, and you will have no problem. Now, of course, there are times where we have 2 bias edges, so then pinning is going to be your friend as well. But in particular, this pattern, another tip on accuracy is if you have a chance to remove your dog ears beforehand. For example, I like to use my point trimmers for a lot of these pieces. This is a 60-degree point, so in the pattern I advise you to use the 60-degree trimmer to trim both the points of the parallelogram and of this unit. So when it's time to fit these together, I don't need to guess how much of my little triangle needs to stick out here. I can just align that flat edge. It's going to be flat on both sides because I trimmed both pieces, and I'm going to get a really nice and accurate seam, and they're going to be even once I sew these 2 together. So the third feature I wanted to mention, last and not least, is whenever we make a little mistake and we want to fix it by ripping a seam apart. Now, seam rippers are not all created equal. These are just some of my preferences. I like the clover, or the number one thing you need to think about your seam rippers is it needs to be sharp. And believe me, if you have sewn a lot, your rippers will get dull with time, just like your sewing machine needles, just like your rotary cutters. That is going to get dull with time. So make sure you have always a very sharp seam ripper. Now, I'm not gonna, it's personal preference on what kind of handle, how long, or brand, or other things. Just key is you want it to be sharp. So as you're ripping a seam, one of the things that you want to avoid, especially if you have any bias edges, is, and this is, I've seen this quite a bit, where people pull the fabrics apart and then rip the seam, and pull apart and rip the seam. Every time you pull apart, you are stretching that fabric a little bit, and you want to really avoid that. So 2 ways I recommend ripping. Either pick your seams with your seam ripper, so pick every 3rd seam like this, and then you carefully pull that apart without stretching the fabrics. Or if you have a long seam and you don't really have any other intersections, you can always start off opening your seam. Use that red ball on your seam ripper, place that on the inside of the seam, and then make sure you move your ripper just straight across down, and that will open up that seam without any stretching. You can easily fit things back together, and things, you will probably end up with a really great piece even though you had to rip it out once. Now, if, for example, you are working on something where you had to rip it out multiple times, and especially if you're working with a bias edge, be really, really careful. It sometimes will get to the point of being really hard to use because ripping out and sewing and ripping out and sewing is always going to affect a little bit the stretching of fabric. So being careful, having a sharp seam ripper is very important when we need to fix those mistakes.